Psalm 34. This is a psalm that I've read through a couple times in the last few months. It seems to be one of the standard psalms that we turn to whenever hardship happens. Let's read verses 17 through verse 19 together. Psalm 34, 17 through 19. When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all of their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. And these are obviously comforting verses. Anytime that we have hardships or heartaches, whenever we have troubles, these verses are ones that we draw comfort from. But if you are anything like me, or as Brittany says, I think weird, if you think weird with me, you tend to question how this happens. How is it that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted? If I can't see him, if I don't get to touch him, if I don't get to hear his voice, how is it that he is near to me whenever I am brokenhearted? Or if he is there, how is it that so oftentimes when I'm brokenhearted, I fail to see it, that he is close? Or why does God allow me to be brokenhearted in the first place? That's been one of the longest theological questions for ever, seemingly. If there is a God who cares, why would he allow you to be brokenhearted and then comfort you in the first place? I don't have all of the easy answers for you. If anybody sells you an easy answer to a complicated question, they're selling something rather than telling you the truth. So I don't have any easy answers for you this morning, but I have possibilities to consider. Before we move off Psalm 34, I would like to note that if you look at the wording both in verse 17 and in verse 19, when the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears. And then in verse 19, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of all of them. I think there's a distinct possibility that we could be suffering because of rebellion in our own lives. Look back in verse 16, for instance. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. The psalmist here in Psalm 34 is not writing to say if you are experiencing any type of upheaval in your life, you are always going to be comforted by God. That isn't the case. The case is sometimes we suffer because of the evil that we have chose to perpetrate in our own lives. Sometimes we suffer because it's a natural consequence of our own sin. That isn't always the case. And we're going to dive into Job for a second. Job's three friends had the mentality that if you suffer because of your sin. Therefore, Job, you must be suffering. Well, that isn't up to Job's friends to decide that, nor is it up for us to decide that either about other people. Maybe it is that we suffer far from God because we are far from God in the choices that we make. But that isn't always the case. And sometimes we suffer for other reasons. Psalm 34 clearly states that the righteous suffer. And that those who seek to do well still suffer in that. And that's what we're looking at this morning. But if it is that we suffer from our own consequences, then just simply saying that the Lord is near those who are righteous isn't the answer to that solution, or isn't the solution to that problem. The solution to that problem is drawing near to God. How about Acts 17? Turn with me over to Acts 17. God also desires that we seek him. Paul is speaking here on Mars Hill to those who do not know God, about the unknown God. There in verse 26 and verse 27, Paul writes, "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries for their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him, yet he is actually not far from each one of us." Maybe that there is still some searching that God requires us to do. Sometimes we want God to reveal himself in a very personal manner when it comes to our comfort or our salvation, rather than us trying to see him behind the scenes. And we'll give a really quick, easy example, the book of Esther. In the Old Testament, there are two books that have been highly contested over time over whether or not they belong in the canon of the Old Testament, not because they're inauthentic, but because there's two books that don't mention the name of God. One is the Song of Solomon, and the other one is the book of Esther. If you didn't expect, if you don't know that, sometimes you can read through Esther and never realize that God's not mentioned once, but he isn't mentioned on any single page of Esther. But it's a beautiful design that we are to read the book of Esther with just a little more insight than both Esther and Mordecai had living through their life. And we are called to see God on every single page, to see him working behind the scenes in the very same way that God works in our life, which is behind the scenes, where he's most certainly operating and most certainly there, but we don't get to see him in the same way that Esther and Mordecai did not get to see him. And so it's a book that as you read it, God's not mentioned, but you are supposed to see him in every one of those areas. In the same way that Paul says that we are to search him and to feel our way towards him, because he's not far from each one of us. But the question is, well, how? How is God near the brokenhearted? And I don't have all of the answers for every single scenario and every single circumstance, but I want to share with you a story. I don't usually share stories, so I hope that you guys give me a little leeway to share a story. My Vietnamese is not very excellent. In fact, it is about as poor as my English is. Well, it's actually more poor than my English is. So if I pronounce the names wrong, just bear with me. There was a Vietnamese interpreter. His name was Hien Phan. And like I said, that might be a terrible pronunciation of his name, and I apologize for that. But he worked as an interpreter for American evangelists during the Vietnam War. Imagine, what that would be like, where him and somebody rather illegally was traveling through the country, preaching the gospel to individuals in small villages, where they would, share homes whenever the people would invite them to stay at the house. They would eat whatever food was put before them, and oftentimes going to sleep with gunfire in the background, always in danger. Well, after Vietnam fell to the communists, he was captured by the Viet Cong and put into a concentration camp or a prison camp, because they believed if he was a translator, then he was probably working for the CIA. And so they stripped him of his English Bible, knowing that he was a Christian, and obviously not really in line with the communist line. They began to bombard him with Marxist and communist propaganda continually. And every night they would berate him for being a Christian and mock him and asking him, if he really believes in God, where is his God? Why is he in this concentration camp? Why would God allow him to be in this scenario if God really exists? And over time he began to crack and to break down, as I think almost any of us would, or probably all of us would, until he began to question the same things that they were questioning him. Does God really exist? Does he really care for me if he does exist? Have I built my entire life on a series of lies? If God does comfort the brokenhearted, where is he now? Until one night, he made the decision, and that was it. He was going to quit. He was never going to talk about God again. He was never going to pray anymore. He was going to give up completely on his faith and never consider. He was going to push every thought of God out of his mind. But the next day, he got up, and one of the guards called him and told him that he was going to be put on latrine duty for the day, which is just as nasty and degrading and as foul as you would imagine it being. And while digging through the latrine and doing his duties for the day, he found a piece of paper that had English writings on it. So without looking at it, he quickly cleaned it off as best as he could, getting all the excrement off, and stuffed it in his pocket for him to read later that night. And he opened up the paper that night whenever he was alone, and he read these words: "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed to us. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. who is to condemn? Jesus Christ is the one who died, and more than that, who was raised and who is now at the right hand of God, who indeed is interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or the sword? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long, and we are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither life, nor death, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all of creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. And if you recognize those verses like Ian recognized those verses, he had grabbed a page from Romans chapter 8. Of all the things to find in the latrine and all the things to clean off and stuff in your pocket, Romans chapter 8 is what he grabbed. And he stated that, "O God, you would not let me be away from you even for a single day." So the next morning, after recommitting himself to his previous faith, he went up to the same guard who gave him latrine duty the day before, and he said, "I want to be on latrine duty today." And the guard got outraged because, well, who wants latrine duty 2 days in a row when you don't have to? And so he granted him his wish and gave him latrine duty not just that day, but indefinitely. And that day, he found another page with English writing that he cleaned the excrement off and stuffed in his pocket. And he found more pages throughout the next few weeks and ended up collecting almost the entire New Testament. Because unknowns to him at the time, the same guard that gave him latrine duty that first day had found an English Bible and was using his pages as toilet paper. And through that process, he was able to collect almost the entire New Testament in prison. You ask the question, well, where is God whenever I'm brokenhearted? Or how is God near the brokenhearted? I think that's an amazing story. But it doesn't stop there. It actually gets more interesting. He eventually gets released from the prison camp, and he finds a group of people who are going to flee Vietnam. Obviously, his Christian beliefs not in line with the communist mindset, and was not able to worship openly, so him and some other people decided that they were going to leave. And they were going to build a boat to sail on the high seas, and they would make it to Taiwan. Or Thailand, sorry. And what ends up happening is, as they are building this large enough boat to sail on the seas, 4 Viet Cong soldiers come up and accost him one day and says, "You're trying to flee, aren't you?" And he lied. He said, "I'm not." And they said, "Well, we know that you are. Just tell us the truth. We know that you were trying to flee Vietnam." He said, "I'm not." Because there wasn't just him. There was 53 other people who were going to be sailing in that boat. And that lie wasn't just to protect him. It was to protect everybody on the boat. But as the 4 Viet Cong left, he felt a lot of remorse because he understood that when it comes to being a Christian, lies have no place in a Christian life. And so he prayed that he was sorry and he repented. He said, "If you would like me to tell the truth to those 4 Viet Cong, bring them back, and I will tell the truth." And so some time went by and the ship was almost done. They were within hours of launching. And those same exact 4 Viet Cong came back and asked him, "You're trying to flee, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes. Me and 53 other people are building a boat and we're fleeing. Are you going to re-imprison me?" And their answer was, "No, we want to come with you." He said that they had met high seas on the trip to Thailand. And it turns out that every one of those 4 Viet Cong soldiers were originally fishermen and were skilled at handling boats, and they would have never made it unless those 4 people didn't sail with them. I don't know all the answers for everything. I don't know exactly how God is going to be near you whenever you're brokenhearted. But I see examples like this all over the place of individuals who lost faith and only to find it in most unexpected places, including a latrine covered in feces. So the question is, well, why is it that I fail to see God in my distress? And I would suggest maybe he and his comforting arms are always there, and sometimes I reject him. I mean, how many times have I ignored a text that came in because, well, I don't want to deal with that person right now, even though they may have been the right person to comfort me at that moment? How many times have I declined phone calls? How many times have I skipped Bible study or worship service because I just can't handle it emotionally right now, only for that to be the exact same thing that should be bringing comfort and help and encouragement at this time? If it takes some people to scrape feces off of one page of the Bible to find comfort and help, why is it that I have Bibles all over the place, and in my distress I don't open them as I ought to? On every one of us who have a cell phone, we probably have or at least a smartphone, we probably have a copy of the Bible, if not all of the copies of the Bible, free and available to us. Not only that, we probably have paper Bibles all over our house. And yet, how many times have I skipped God's comfort that is readily available to me and is near to me when other people long for only a small fraction of what I have? How about 1 Kings chapter 19? 1 Kings chapter 19. Sometimes I want God to give his comfort in massive ways, and earthquakes and fires and in loud winds and whirlwinds, and what if that isn't at all what God has planned? In 1 Kings 18, Elijah goes and he defeats the prophets of Baal. An amazing show of God's strength. Fire comes down from heaven, consumes not only the sacrifice, but the water that surrounded the sacrifice and the altar itself. And then at the end of chapter 18, after 3.5 years, he prays for God to let it rain. And for the first time in 3.5 years, it rains on that very day. And then chapter 19 comes around, and he is now going to plead for God to simply take his life. And in verse 9, then he came to a cave, and he lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They have thrown down your altars, and they have killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I alone, am left, and they seek to take my life away." And he said, Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind tore the mountains and broke into pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak, and he went out, and he stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Sometimes we want the earthquake, we want the fire, we want something amazing to happen to just change my life in all the circumstances that I'm in, and I want to ignore the small, still voice. But God's in the small, still voice. Sometimes I reject his comfort because it's not what I was expecting. And I only want things on my terms sometimes. I need to accept God's help in however it comes, his comfort wherever it may be found, whether it be in a fire or in an earthquake or a whirlwind or in a small, still voice. Oftentimes we reject what God offers and then blames him for it never being there in the first place. Like I said, I don't know all of the answers for everything. I hope that those may give some inclination of what happens. But there was still one other question we haven't touched yet of why does God allow me to be so brokenhearted in the first place? And I have, lo and behold, more disappointment for you. I don't have all the answers for that either. But Romans chapter 8. I want to point you back to the very same verse that Hien found on the very first day in the latrine. And there in verse 28, for we know that those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Oftentimes when we go through hardship or trials, or often when we're brokenhearted, we have no idea why. And sometimes, with long hindsight, we can look back and we can see God's purpose. Sometimes 10, 15, 25 years later, we can say, I see what was created through that circumstance. I understand how God wove the strands of my life without me knowing what was coming. But sometimes we can't. I don't think Job got to see the purpose in his lifetime. How hard would that be to be Job? Where you're rewarded in the end, but still you never get answers and you never understand really what happens. And yet, through Job, James says we can see the purpose of God. That for all of these thousands of years later, we still talk about Job on a pretty regular basis. Sometimes you don't get to see what happens as a result of God weaving your life together. But that's where faith comes in. God gives us a mountain of evidence that he exists. He gives us overwhelming evidence that he has sent Jesus as his son, who truly lived, truly died, and was truly resurrected. It's one of the most sure things of history that Jesus lived and died. And there is amazing evidence for his resurrection. Now, what that does is that bridges the gap of faith a lot for us. And what God asked us to do is to take that last little step on faith, that whatever we're currently going through, whatever we're suffering through, whatever it is that we are made to walk today, is going to work together for good if we continue to love him. And when we're brokenhearted, whenever we are going through the hardship, that is a massive leap. But consider how much God has already bridged for you, so that step is that much smaller. We aren't always told exactly why. Both James and Peter give us other ideas, additional ideas, I should say. But we're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1. You probably know these verses pretty well, verse 6 and verse 7. Peter writes, both 1 and 2 Peter, dealing with individuals who are going to be suffering. And especially 2 Peter seems to be the last letter that Peter writes. And his own death seems to be a predominant thought on his mind as he writes 2 Peter. It comes forward pretty clearly. But in both of these books, he weaves together a narrative that there is a purpose in that. Consider verse 6 and verse 7. He says, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it's tested by fire, may be found to the results in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Peter says that we should rejoice in the fact that God is working and weaving in our lives. That's a big step. Because he says, so that for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved. But there is a goal to it, that your faith may be found to be praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Or James phrases it this way in chapter 1 and verse 2 and verse 3, that when you meet trials of various kinds, you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect. They may be perfect and complete and lacking in nothing. That there is this process that God is working through us. And it takes faith for us to go through that process, not knowing what the end is going to be, but believing that God is truly going to work the best for us in that scenario. So when you go back to Psalm 34, and David writes that the Lord hears the cries of the righteous and delivers them out of all of them. and that the Lord is near the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit, and that many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of all of them. I hope that maybe we've given a little extra insight into how that happens. Maybe it's digging through a latrine to find a single piece of paper to restore faith. Maybe it's the phone call that we've turned down, or the text message we've ignored, or the worship service or the Bible class that we've skipped. Maybe you don't get the phone call, or you don't get a text message. Maybe it's just the Bible that you have walked by and you have not picked up. The Lord is truly there, near to the brokenhearted. And the question comes up, are we demanding a fire and a whirlwind, or are we willing to listen to the small, still voice? Are we willing to walk like Esther walked, never seeing God anywhere and yet seeing him behind every single page? Do we truly have faith that whatever we are going through now, God is able to work through that for good? And those are big areas of faith. That's a big part of our life as Christians, to walk by faith and to not by sight. But I want to end kind of where we had begun earlier, is if we are suffering because we are far from God, then there is no there's no benefit from that suffering if we do not turn back to God. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 that God is the God of all comfort and the God of all peace and hope, but that only comes to those who turn to him. And if we walk away thinking, well, God's always going to be near me just because Psalm 34 says he's near the brokenhearted, then we miss the point that he is near the righteous when they're brokenhearted. And he is against those who work evil. And if we can encourage you to return to him, or if you need prayers in any way, let us know. We will sing our song of invitation, number 754.